Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I am going to be talking about arguments patterns as stated in natural language discourse. In particular, I'm going to be introducing from logical form. So roughly the question is how can you tell what a logical form of an argument is when that argument is stated in English and not in a kind of a well-represented formal language. And how do we individuate argument patterns in natural language? Okay, so let's start simply. So here is a kind of a simple example. If you have something like, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? It seems like an instance of an argument P, therefore P. And then you might wonder, well, how can we characterize when an argument is valid when stated in natural language discourse? And you might have a very simple account of that. Something roughly of the following form. You say that an argument is valid just in case it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. That's sort of kind of a simple, very simplistic idea. Obviously, things get very complicated very quickly. So the first way in which things might be complicated concerns ambiguity, right? So natural language contains ambiguities. And so we have to take that into account when we are individuating argument, when we're individuating logical forms. So take something like 2. John is at bank, therefore John is at bank, right? Now, this seems like an instance of the same kind of an argument we've seen just a moment ago. However, if I told you that the 2 words bank are disambiguated differently, one as denoting the financial institution, one as denoting a river bank, then this wouldn't be an instance of the same pattern. We know how to deal with these kinds of things. So in particular, you would say, well, there's actually two items, bank 1 and bank 2, and so the real logical form deviates from what you see at surface, right? And you have to take that into account when you're characterizing validity. Things are a little bit more complicated when you're dealing with context sensitivity. So take something like I'm happy, therefore I'm happy, right? Well, this again seems like an instance of the same kind of an argument. However, if I told you that, if I said the premise and you said the conclusion, that's a kind of happy state of affairs about our friendship. It's not a logical entailment, right? And so we have to take that into account as well. So if the speakers change, then this is no longer valid. And you can get these examples. You can generate them ad nauseum. So something like now is now. If I'm speaking very slowly, right, you might get a failure of the law of identity. Okay, so this is not news, obviously. We know how to deal with these things as well. The kind of a traditional answer to how one should deal with these things tells you that you have to control for context. And in particular, you must not allow for shifting context as you're evaluating an argument. You have to hold the context fixed. So here is the kind of, it goes back to, well, at least Kaplan arguably earlier. You say that you ban context shifting mid-argument, and you say an argument is valid just in case for all context and all models if the premises are true in the context and the model, then the conclusion is also true. So hold the context fixed, right? That's the kind of an answer. Now, that answer also leads to complications, which I'm going to turn to in just a second. In fact, it turns out that, even if we impose this kind of ban on context shifting, it seems like we still have trouble characterizing validity for certain patterns that involve context-sensitive language. And in particular, you might wonder how this connects to the conditionals topic of our workshop. The kind of arguments I'm going to be looking at, in particular, deal with conditional sentences, and so I'm going to be caring about conditional logic. I'm going to look at the complications in light of the kind of ban on context shifting strategy. We're going to see that doesn't quite work. Then we're going to try to see how we can characterize maybe context sensitivity in a slightly different way, which might be friendly to the traditional old-fashioned idea. However, we'll see that even that faces some kinds of problems. And then I'm going to argue that basically the way you have to think about arguments when you're dealing with context sensitivity in natural language is as structured discourses and not just sets of sentences or relations between sets of sentences. I'm going to end up with a bonus, and then I'm going to draw some conclusions. Okay, so let's see what. Okay, so what are the computations? Well, first is this famous counterexample to Modus Tollens. There's a number of these in the literature. I'm going to focus on this one that goes back to a paper by McGee. And here's the setup. Okay, so we're back in time, and opinion polls are taken just before the 1980s election, and they show that a Republican, Reagan, is decisively ahead of the Democrat Carter, with the other Republican in the race, Anderson, being a distant third. Right? And so this is what you know, and it seems like in that kind of a context, you have reason to believe 6 and 7, but 8 does not follow, right? So if a Republican wins the election, then if the winner is not Reagan, it'll be Anderson. Or a Republican will win. So if the winner is not Reagan, it will be Anderson. And so the observation is just supposed to be that, look, you know that if the winner is not Reagan, it will be Carter. He is the second best ranked. So it seems like, given that you know that, the conclusion in H should not be accepted. This is stated in terms of a reason to believe. You can boost your intuition in thinking about truth as well. In this kind of context, but I'm going to set that aside for now. Okay, now why is this problematic? Well, the problem is that the bad and context shifting is not quite going to help us here, given a kind of a standard semantics for conditional, say, of the sort we've seen, some of which we've seen yesterday. So take a kind of a Lewis Stojnić account of conditionals. They're going to predict that this inference pattern is valid, and then the big question is supposed to be, well, how do you explain why this argument pattern seems to be valid? And I'm going to put some details on that in just 1 second. Okay, another kind of a problem. It's a sort of it's connected to the first pattern. That is the so-called import-export inference pattern. On the kind of a standard semantics, this pattern, standard semantics, strict conditional account, this pattern is not valid, yet we don't seem to find counterexamples to a pattern of this sort. So here is just one instance. So suppose there was a murder at the mansion, and we know that one of the 3 staff members are the culprits. And so in that scenario in particular, we know that if the butler is innocent, and the gardener is innocent, then the cook is the culprit. The cook is guilty. It seems like that entails 10. If the butler is innocent, then if the gardener is innocent, then the cook is guilty. In fact, they seem equivalent, right? The problem is that the standard account would invalidate this pattern, right? Even holding the context fixed. So there's no funny business about context shifting. Okay. So the problem. So the 2 inference patterns are creating attention because, in fact, it turns out that if you have a semantics that validates both modus ponens, the first inference pattern, and import-export, the second one, and under very minimal assumptions about your logic of conditionals, right, you're going to collapse material conditional into indicative conditional into material conditional. So this is a result that goes back to Alan Gibbert, that tells you roughly that the semantics that validates both modus ponens and import-export, assuming a classical consequence relation, so deduction theorem, right, collapses the conditional into material conditional. Okay, so that's trouble because, well, first of all, modus ponens is kind of an inference pattern that you might want to have in any well-behaved, a vast array of well-behaved logics we might consider. But it seems like also the exportation pattern is intuitively valid, so what gives? The verdict that McGee gives is that the standard semantics, and I have here a sketch, right? So the standard semantics tells you that the conditional is true in a context and a world, just in case the closest antecedent worlds are consequent worlds as well. So that's the rough characterization. I'm not going to worry about the slight differences between different versions of this account. It doesn't matter for our purposes. The standard contextual semantics then would validate modus ponens, but it would not explain on the face of it why the inference pattern strikes, the one I showed you earlier, strikes us as bad. And worse, they invalidate exportation, which seems like intuitively valid pattern, right? So it gets things exactly backwards. Okay. And notice that that's true even if you hold the context fixed, so no funny business about context shifting, so what is going on? One kind of a reaction you might have to this is to say, well, maybe we haven't characterized context sensitivity in exactly the right kind of a way. Maybe there's a different way of thinking about context sensitivity that that is going to explain this this tension away, right? And I'm going to try to suggest one potential way, which I think makes some progress. Obviously, there has been a number of others in the literature. I'm going to turn to that in my bonus section. But for now, let's just play along with this attempt to characterize it as slightly more. Okay. So here's one way to think about things. So maybe we didn't characterize context sensitivity in exactly the right way. Maybe context has to feature into the determination of true conditions in a slightly different way than what the standard semantics tells us. Here's one idea. Well, so let's look at the kind of silly problems that I've looked at the beginning, and let's try to sort of connect them to the kind of inference patterns that I'm looking at here. So consider this pattern that I have here. So it looks like this. If Jane is out, then she's having fun. If Jane is out, so she, and now I'm pointing to Mary, is having fun. Okay, so this is not going to fly, right? If you submit this to a journal as a counterexample to Modus Tollens, it will not be successful. Now, that's not just, obviously, what's going on here is that you kind of have a contextual effect, right, that on the resolution of pronouns, and so you would say this is not really an instance of Modus Tollens, even though, you know, if you take these brackets away, it seems like one. It's a similar type of shape, right? And the idea is, well, look, we know that pronouns are sensitive in this way, that even across an argument, they can change their value. And so maybe the context features into the interpretation of the modals in a similar way. And I actually think that that is on the right track. However, as we're going to see, it's not going to solve everything for us. So why is it on the right track? Well, in fact, and this has been noted in the literature. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but there's good reasons to think of modal expressions in general and conditionals in particular as being partially anaphoric in a similar way as pronouns are, right? So I've argued for that like elsewhere. I'm not going to spend too much time. I'm just going to give you an example that kind of gives you an intuitive feel for what I have in mind. So consider 14 and 15. So 14 is just a classic case of modal subordination. If I tell you a wolf might walk in and would eat you, normally understand the second sentence as restricted by the possibility mentioned in the first one. They're not unrelated, right? The idea is that you get a restricted meaning with the wolf would eat you, given that one might walk in, not just come one may, right? And so one way to characterize this, the way I'm going to sort of try to propose to you, is as thinking of the modal as being anaphoric, as searching a sort of a possibility that's going to restrict its domain of quantification. Right? And this possibility can be provided in a similar way as with pronouns, either from the non-linguistic context or from the prior discourse. Okay, and note that a similar kind of a thing happens with conditional sentences as well. So here's one example. Suppose you have this antidote that has the following property. If you administer it without there being a snake bite, it kills you, right? But if you get it after a snake bite, it saves your life, right? And then now consider 15. If the snake escapes, it will bite you. If you get the antidote, you will live. Okay? Now, again, the observation is that if you get a restricted reading in the second conditional, the idea is if you get the antidote, given that the snake escapes and bites you, then you will live, if not just come with me. If you get an antidote, and then you will die, unless the snake bites you. Okay. So here is then a proposal. So standardly, and this is a very, very basic way of thinking, this is just a strict conditional, truth condition for a conditional. Let's take that kind of a standard strict conditional account, and let's just embellish it a little bit more so that we allow for this kind of anaphoric dependency to be tracked across context. Right? So if the standard account tells you that the conditional is true at a world just in case all of the accessible worlds that are antecedent worlds are also consequent worlds. Now we're going to say a conditional is true relative to some prominent possibility P just in case all of the accessible worlds that are prominent and that are antecedent words are also consequent words. Well, the prominence is giving you basically a domain restriction for the quantification of a conditional, right? That can be recovered in this kind of anaphoric way. Okay. Well, this is neat because it now allows you to kind of connect our original counterexamples to our problematic counterexamples to our silly counterexamples. So we've seen that we have we have to be careful about how we interpret pronouns across discourse if we want to avoid equivocal inferences. So maybe what we need to do in order to account for what's going on is to, in a similar way, be careful about how modal anaphorics resolved to avoid equivocal inferences again. And so one attempt to do that is just to appeal to a kind of a principle of uniformity, which is basically just the old idea that we see at the beginning of kind of banning the context shift. The idea is once you're kind of giving an argument, you're committing yourself to a context being stable and the relevant context-sensitive items being interpreted in a uniform way, if you like. Okay, so that's a kind of a gist to say that just for pronouns that have to be resolved in a uniform way, so that suddenly she does not switch from Mary to Jane, right? So similarly, you have to do the same thing with this and conditionals. So then the idea would be that, so if you have our counterexample, the idea would be you kind of have a sort of like a hidden element in a conditional, and then what you require is that the consequent of the right nested conditional in 6 be indexed in the same way as the one in 8, that is that they be resolved in the same way, that they have the same restriction, if you like. They're resolved in a uniform way, as I would say, right? Now, the problem with this is that uniformity is not really a solution. It's a problem in itself, and especially if you're coming at it from this traditional idea of banning context shift, right? So if that's your strategy. Why is that? Well, so notice that you, in fact, have 3 conditionals here, and you have 3 choices on how to interpret the restriction on the domain of quantification. In particular, you have to rule out the reading according to which all 3 conditionals are going to be indexed in the same way. Obviously, there's reasons to think that conditionals restrict their consequence in a certain way. I think that a more general solution is needed, so I'm going to bracket that for this. And the same deal goes, same goes for the exportation inference. If you think that what's going on is some kind of funky context business, then you have to somehow rule out the reading according to which all 3 conditionals are indexed. Okay. So in particular, uniformity constraint in itself is too powerful, right? It gives you more than what you actually see, right? And so the question is going to be, well, can we constrain this in a certain way? And I think that we can, but that's going to require thinking about argument patterns in a slightly different way, that is thinking about their logical forms in a richer way than what we're used to. Okay, so let's look at some reasons for that. In particular, I'm going to suggest that the way the context sensitivity is resolved in these kinds of cases is determined by mechanisms that are structuring discourse, mechanisms of discourse structure, and that they basically are a part of the logical form of the argument, and they're kind of recipes for building propositional content, if you like, right? And so in a sense, you can't really ban context shifting because context shifting is encoded in the rules that structure a discourse to begin. But we're going to get there slowly, so let's start with a simple example. So what's going to matter for us is this mechanism of discourse structure, of discourse coherence. So here's just one example to give you a sense of the kind of mechanisms I have in mind. So this is an example from Taylor. It's actually earlier, I think it's from Smith. Now suppose that I tell you 16 and that I'm not pointing at anybody, right? I have my hand behind my back. Right, and I tell you, Phil tickled Stanley and Liz poked him. Right? There's at least 2 ways you understand this, right? So one is this kind of what happened to Stanley reading, right? So everybody sort of piled up on him. Phil tickled him, Liz poked him being Stanley. Another is kind of this kind of sort of what happened as a result reading, where the second bit of discourse describes the result of the event described in the first one, right? Now, the reason why I'm showing you this, the observation is supposed to be that the way the discourse is organized guides the resolution of a pronoun. In particular, how you understand the two bits of discourse to be connected into a coherent whole affects the resolution of the pronoun. And these two processes are mutually constraining, and in fact, I've argued stronger that the establishing coherence in discourse determines the resolution of a pronoun downstream. I'm happy to talk about that more in the case of pronouns, but I'm going to move to modals. But just the basic observation is that just like any discourse, so the idea is that discourse is more than just a random sequencing of information in no particular order. It has a structure, and the speakers have to signal that structure in a way that their audience can pick up on according to certain shared standards, and how the discourse is structured guides or determines the resolution of relevant context-sensitive items. So it in particular guides the resolution of pronominal anaphora here. And then the idea is, well, arguments are discourses as well. They're likewise structured, and we have to take that into account when we're individuating their logical forms. So the idea is that a discourse is kind of as a recipe for building propositional patterns, if you like. All right, what about, well, this is pronouns, right? But what about modals? Well, I want to suggest that for modals, the same thing goes. I'm not going to give you many examples. I'm happy to give you more in the Q&A, but just for the interest of time, I'm going to give you one that sort of suggests to me that these kinds of mechanisms force a particular interpretation, and they do so in a kind of grammaticized way. They do so as a matter of a kind of a grammatical rule. So here's an example I want to look at. We've seen it yesterday in Paolo's talk, and it has been taken as a kind of an argument for the refutation of the idea that modal expressions express true conditional content. But I want to suggest sort of a simpler, more straightforward explanation of what's going on. So consider 17. Tells you, suppose it's raining, and it may not be raining. It's kind of a weird thing to ask somebody to suppose, right? Because it feels somehow incoherent. And the worry is that there is a number of ways in which you can interpret this modal in a context that will give you a perfectly consistent interpretation, right? So for instance, suppose it's raining and I don't know that it's raining, it's perfectly fine. Suppose that it's raining and the relevant contextually provided body of information leaves raining open, or rules out raining is again perfectly consistent. So something weird is going on here. If you have a standard contextualist account of modality, right, you can't really provide a restriction on the domain of quantification of this modal that predicts an intuitive truth condition. And so the verdict is supposed to be that the context can't do the job. Now I want to suggest, no, the verdict should be something different. Look, so here you have a conjunction. You have a possibility introduced in the first conjunct, namely that it is raining. The second conjunct further elaborates on that possibility. This elaboration relation makes the possibility prominent and forces it as a restriction on the modal might in the second conjunct, right? And so you get a kind of a restricted reading in a similar way we've seen before, namely that it might not be raining given that it's raining, and that's a contradiction, right? That's inconsistent. Now notice that that's robust and persistent, even in the face of these nearby interpretations that you could be picking out instead, and so it suggests that it's a kind of a forced rule, right? It's a part of the interpretation of a discourse as a matter of a rule, not as a matter of kind of general pragmatic bias. Okay. So taking that on board now, let's try to use that to account for our problematic cases. So take Modus Tollens again. Here's the idea. The thought is, well, the argument is also a structured discourse. In particular, the premises tend to a conclusion in a premise-conclusion relation, which requires that the conclusion be interpreted, which makes prominent for the interpretation of the conclusion the body information that incorporates the information expressed by the premises. So the first premise introduces a conditional. The antecedent introduces a possibility, one in which a Republican is the winner. The consequent further elaborates on that possibility. The elaboration makes it prominent, and that restricts the interpretation of the conditional in the consequent. Now, the second, the consequent itself is a conditional. It introduces a possibility relative to what just made prominent, namely the one in which the winner is not Reagan. The consequence of the embedded conditional further elaborates on that. The elaboration relation is prominent, and you get the reading that the winner will be Anderson, given that a Republican wins and it's not Reagan. The second premise elaborates on the body information incorporating the first one, and it further asserts that a Republican will win. And now the conclusion relation passes that down to the conclusion, forcing this restriction, namely that the conditional in the consequent is interpreted relative to a body information incorporating the information stated by the premises. So schematically, you get something like this, where P is some prominent possibility discourse initially, so incorporating the information we know about the scenario. Then we get, given what we know about the scenario and that a Republican will win, then given that, and that the winner is not Reagan and will be Anderson. Moreover, given what we know about the scenario, right, a Republican will win. So finally, and now the conclusion forces the body information incorporating the premises, which is just our cue here. And we'll get, if the winner is not Reagan, it will be Anderson, given what we know and given the fact that a Republican will win. Okay, that's the idea. What about import-export? Well, it's the same deal, right? So in particular, if P is a prominent body information discourse initially telling us about the murder, what we've learned, then given that, and given that the butler is innocent and the gardener is innocent, the cook is guilty, so the antecedent introduces a possibility relative to the prominent possibility. The consequent elaborates on it, the elaboration makes the possibility prominent, and that restricts the interpretation of the consequent. Now what about the right nested conditional intent? Well, we get the same kind of a thing, right? So relative to what we know about the murder, right? And we introduce the possibility that the butler is innocent. The consequence elaborates on it, the elaboration makes it prominent, and that feeds into the restriction of the conditional in the consequent. And so we get a restricted interpretation, given what we know, and given that the butler is innocent. And moreover, now that the gardener is innocent, the cook is guilty. Okay, so it's exactly the same kind of thing. So now notice that this is going to, what this means is that this is going to express a slightly different pattern that we would normally get with unrestricted exploitation. So we're going to ask, well, how can we use that now to individuate the relevant argument pattern? So what does this tell us about the original arguments? What does this tell us about the validity of Modus Tollens or the validity of exploitation, given the kind of a structure I've given you? How does this explain anything? Okay, so let's look at that. So the idea is going to be this, right? So arguments are more than merely individuating a set of premises and conclusions that should be individuated partly by this structure. And the discourse structure in turn is going to build informational pattern expressed. And that's going to give you a way of extracting the logical form of an argument from its structure. Right? And so capturing the effects of discourse structure is going to allow for a system that probably preserves classical logic. Now, how is that? Well, I'm going to sketch that for you in just a second, and I should have find this.
So you have half an hour.
Half an hour, excellent. Okay, so let me just draw the consequences for thinking about the argument pattern. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. What we're going to do is we're going to implement this idea by thinking about, as I said, the discourse as a kind of a recipe for building propositional pattern expressed by each clause, right? And the way we're going to do that is by keeping track of how discourse structure affects the resolution of modal anaphora. The way we're going to do that is by assuming a kind of a prominence ranking of possibilities that can be affected by different elements that the discourse contains. Right? That's the basic idea. Okay, so let's unpack that. So the context is just going to be thought of as a running record, a kind of a conversational scoreboard that keeps track of the moves that have been made in the discourse so far. So in particular, it's going to keep track of what happened before, what has been made prominent, what has been demoted. You can think about it as a kind of a Kaplanian context dynamicist, right? Now, we are going to abstract away from the elements of the conversational record that are not relevant to the interpretation of modal and conditional discourse. So in particular, the only element that we're going to focus on is the ranking of possibilities according to their relative prominence. And the idea is going to be those rank higher are going to be preferred for the resolution than those ranked lower. More specifically, a modal expression or a conditional is going to be picking up the most prominent possibility in the discourse at the point at which it occurs, right? And now, and we can sort of model that as a kind of we're using stacked disciplines, so taking an assignment function as a kind of a stack that ranks possibilities according to their contents. And then what we're going to do is we're going to think of the meaning of a discourse as a kind of relation between contexts, between stacks of this form, in a sort of a dynamic framework that is going to incorporate the effect that what the discourse has on the prominence ranking of possibilities. Right? So, in particular, we have seen that discourse has conventionalized effect on prominence ranking, and that can change as the discourse evolves or progresses. Okay, making an effect on what the state of the context at any given point is. Now, okay, so now we're moved into this kind of a dynamic framework. What happened to our old truth conditions? Well, they're still there. What we're going to do is we're going to take this kind of a truth condition we have, and then we're going to wrap around the dynamic system on top of that. That is just going to determine the value of this prominent possibility at any given point, right? So in that way, it's kind of going to build the proposition as you go, right? So let's do that. So we're taking these kinds of truth conditions, and now we're going to define another layer of meaning on top of that, this kind of dynamic meaning, that is going to tell us how a discourse builds a proposition. Okay. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the details of how you specify the function exactly. I can show you that in the Q&A if you like. I'm going to just give you a sense of how this works. So take our Modus Tollens argument. So I told you that it's a structure, right? That relates the premises to a conclusion via premise-conclusion relation. The premise-conclusion relation has an effect on prominence ranking, and in particular, it makes the possibility incorporating the information expressed by the premises prominent at the time at which you evaluate the conclusion. Right? So here's how this works. The first line is our first premise, that's the right nested conditional. It starts with I'm using the top E to just signal the prominent possibility at a particular point in discourse. So we start with a prominent possibility being just the one that incorporates the information about the polls, right? Then we introduce the possibility, the antecedent possibility in which a Republican wins relative to that. The consequent, the nested conditional, elaborates on that. The elaboration relation makes that possibility prominent, and that's our new value for top E here, right? Now, relative to that, we introduce a possibility in which it's not Reagan who wins, right? And the final consequent elaborates on that, makes that possibility prominent, and relative to that, it checks whether all those are the ones in which Anderson is the winner. Okay. Now, the second premise is going to elaborate on that information. And it's just going to assert that the winner is a Republican. That's not interesting. It just adds a bit of information to what we already know. And finally, now this is the point at which things are interesting, right? So the conclusion relation is going to make prominent the body of information that incorporates the information we knew before, including what's been asserted by the two premises, right? And so we're going to have the information here that entails everything we know about the polls, plus that the conditional is sure that the Republican is the winner. And relative to that, we're going to introduce a possibility in which the winner is not Reagan, and then elaborate requiring that all those are the ones in which the winner is the winners. So schematically, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but basically what you get is the following. So where P is your prominent possibility discourse initially, what you know, right? Then the structure you get, the propositional pattern you get is basically this. Given that possibility, and given that a Republican is the winner, then, well, now elaboration makes, again, that possibility prominent, so that's the first two conjuncts here. Given that, plus that Reagan is the loser, Anderson is the winner. Now, the second premise just asserts, relative to what we know initially, that a Republican is indeed the winner, and now we run Modus Tollens on that. So in particular, the conclusion relation makes the body information incorporating the premises prominent again, and relative to that, it introduces a possibility that Reagan loses and checks that Anderson wins. Now, in particular, the thing to note is just that the information expressed by the conclusion, by the consequent of the right nested conditional and the conclusion are going to be exactly the same proposition. And so that's what you get. And here it is. Okay. Now, what about the exportation? Well, notice now, okay, so notice that the modus ponens argument on this account, this actually turns out to be a modus ponens argument. So we might ask, well, what has gone wrong? Didn't you tell us that that was a counterexample? Well, the idea is that basically it's a counterexample only if you don't look at it as a kind of a structured argument. So the idea is that you kind of can't forget by the time you reach the conclusion that there is an anaphoric element in the conclusion that is tied to what came before in the discourse. So if you look at it as a genuine piece of discourse, then indeed the conclusion is going to follow. The only reason why you're forced to revise is because you kind of forget this kind of an anaphoric link. And it's actually easy to see that if you think about it in the following way. So now notice that one just sounds weird. Right? So the idea is, if you look at it as a kind of a free-floating sentence, there's no telling which proposition it expresses, and in particular, if you look at it as a kind of a comment on the overall body of information we have, it's just going to sound false. However, once we take it as a part of an argument, the proposition expressed is going to be different, namely one that incorporates the anaphoric element, and that's why this argument pattern is going to be valid as a structured discourse. What about, so modus ponens is valid, what about exportation? Well, here's what's going on in the kind of an example we looked at. Again, we do the same thing. So in particular, here is the structure. They're connected by a conclusion relation again. The first conditional introduces a possibility relative to the top-rank possibility in which the butler is innocent. Then we further elaborate on that and add that the gardener is innocent as well. Then finally, the consequent elaborates on all that and requires that in all those possibilities, the cook is guilty. Now we take the second conditional. Relative to the prominent body information, we introduce the information that the butler is innocent. The consequent elaborates on that. Elaboration relation makes it prominent, and that constrains the interpretation of the conditional in the consequent, right? So we get the interpretation that given what we know and given that the butler is innocent, and moreover, given the gardener is innocent, we get the okay. So this again seems, so the pattern what we get is the following. In particular, here is what the proposition computed by the first conditional is. It's just going to be this conjunctive antecedent. So given what we know and given that the butler is innocent and given that the gardener is innocent, the cook is guilty. What's going to happen with the right nested one? Well, we're going to get first given what we know and given that the butler is innocent, then, and now the conclusion elaborates on that. The elaboration makes it prominent, and that's our first two conjuncts here. We get the reading that given what we know and given that the butler and the gardener are innocent, the cook is guilty. Now, obviously, this is valid, but this is also not the exportation pattern. It's a more restricted pattern than coherence. It's a kind of a boring validity, if you like. You get kind of the P there for P. Right? Okay, so in other words, the idea is that given the kind of a structure that exportation pattern expresses in English, you can't express unrestricted exportation to begin with. You're forced to express this more constrained propositional pattern as a matter of the way the discourse is structured. So in other words, you cannot forget that you are restricted by the antecedent here because there is a forced anaphoric link that is being lost otherwise. Okay. How much time is that? 20 minutes. Okay. Okay. So let's just take stock here. At this point, we have a system that validates Modus Tollens, that's good. That invalidates exportation, that's also good. So unrestricted exportation is going to be invalid. That's not surprise because remember, my conditional is just a strict conditional, so it's not going to go in for exportation. But it still captures both intuitions, right? So in particular, it explains why Modus Tollens strikes us as funny in the kind of example I've given you. It also explains why you get this kind of an intuition of an anaphoric connection in exactly the same example. So in particular, if you just said, okay, it's a counterexample, then it would be hard for us to explain this, right? And finally, it also explains the intuition about the validity of exportation pattern. However, it does so by sort of extracting this more restricted inference pattern, the kind of a boring validity from which you actually get by the pairs of conditional in question. Okay, now let's look at just a final bonus. You might think now, okay, so all this work for nothing. Look at how ugly my logical forms are. Why would you sign up for something as disgusting as this when we know and love systems that do a lot of similar work already for free? So why would you sign up for something that looks so gross like this if you can do a lot of the same work in a kind of a system that is already familiar? And indeed, there are various systems that are already familiar that can do some of the similar work, in particular that can deliver the validity of both exportation and Modus Tollens. One way to do that would be to go in for a kind of an informational consequence relation of the sort we've seen yesterday in Paolo's talk. So in particular, here's the basic description, and I'm not going to spend too much time on details here because it's familiar to the audience. But the idea is, so if you think of a context as a kind of a body of information that evolves as the discourse progresses, a kind of a Stojnić, if you like, context set, then you might think of sentences as describing updates on that kind of a context, right? And in particular, a sentence is going to be accepted in a context just in case the update with it doesn't further change it. And then you can characterize validity in the following way. You can say that an argument is valid just in case for any given context. Updating the context with the premises will deliver a context that accepts the conclusion. Now couple this with a kind of a dynamic account of a conditional that you get, or if you like, an expressivist account of a conditional that you get in these kinds of dynamic update semantics. That is going to deliver both Modus Tollens and exportation. The trick is going to be to give up on the classical notion of consequence relation. And you may think, okay, so that's a lot less gross than what I have, right? Because it does not add any extra structure over and above just the sentential structure that you already have. And it predicts the intuitions about the two argument patterns that I've given you at the beginning. Now, I do think that there's something to be gained by kind of moving to the system that I've described. And in particular, I think that there is a sense in which the kind of a system that we have here can't really keep track of what intuitively seems like equivocation. Now, let me just explain by giving an example of this. So here is a counterexample to Modus Tollens. This one is from Satyelson. There's a myriad of others in the literature. And they all have a similar kind of a structure. So in particular in this one, suppose you have an urn, in it you have 100 marbles, and here's what you know. 10 of them are big and blue, 30 are big and red, 50 are small and blue, and 10 are small and red. I select one at random, I hide it, and you don't know which one I have. In that case, you know 18 and 19, and 20 doesn't follow, right? So in particular, if the marble is big, then it's likely red. That's true, because most of the big ones are red. But the marble is not likely red, because it's likely small and blue. So the marble is not big, terrible inference, something has gone wrong, right? And now you're kind of pressed with a choice. Is this a discovery, or is this a disaster, right? Now, the sort of an informational consequence relation account is going to invalidate this pattern. It's going to say, no, this is not a valid inference pattern. You can easily see that if you think that the conditional is going to be accepted just in case hypothetically updating with the antecedent lets you in the context in which consequent is accepted, then you can describe a state that accepts both 18 and 19, but in which will fail to accept 20, right? Or, in other words, you can describe a state that you can update with 18 and 19, and you're not going to end up in a state that's going to accept 20 as well. Now you might think, well, this is exactly what we want. Look, this is a gross inference pattern, right? It's not valid, so pattern count that invalidates it gives the right verdict, and there is a long list of proponents of this kind of a reaction. I want to say no, there is a misequivocation in this argument of a similar kind we have seen before, where you are not keeping track of how the anaphoric dependencies between modal expressions are being calculated. And so in particular, in the kind of system that I've just shown you, here's what you would get. So for the two premises, they're going to be related by a contrast relation. Contrast requires that the two bits of discourse contribute contrasting information about some body of information. Which one? Well, the one that tells you what we know about the scenario, right? And now, so the first premise is going to be a conditional again. Relative to what we know about the scenario, it's going to introduce a hypothetical scenario in which the marble is big. The consequent is going to elaborate on that. The elaboration relation is going to make it prominent, and the modal in the consequent is going to be restricted by it. So you get the reading that the marble is likely red, given that it is big and given what we know. Right? So in particular, the value of the top rank possibility changes between the antecedent and the consequent. Now, the small premise stands in contrast relation to the big one. That makes the body of information that the two bits of discourse contribute contrasting information about. Which one is that? Well, that's the one that describes the scenario. That's the one that's made prominent here, and the modal in the consequent, in the small premise is restricted by it. So you get the reading that the marble is a likely red, or not likely red, given all we know. So in particular, and I'm going to skip the gross details, I'm going to just give you the breakdown. So what you get is the following, and this is obviously not valid. So again, where P is my prominent possibility, so we get that the marble is big given the prominent possibility and the marble is big, then it is likely red. It is not likely red given the prominent possibility. Now, of course, it does not follow that it is not big, but you wouldn't expect it to follow, right? The argument equivocates on the interpretation of the modal in the small premise and the consequent of the big one. So the breakdown you get, so in particular you see that this is not an instance of Modus Tollens, right? And it's not an instance of Modus Tollens, it does not exhibit that kind of a logical form in virtue of the structure of the discourse that comprises the argument, right? And so it's not a wonder that you get a counterexample, but it's also not with regard to the relevant inference pattern. So the breakdown, what you get is exactly what you would expect on the kind of a classical system with a strict conditional, right? So modus ponens is valid, modus tollens is also valid, exportation is invalid, but we get the right kind of a prediction about all three cases, right? So in particular, we explain why modus ponens strikes us problematic in the original case. We explain why exportation strikes us as valid even though it's invalid, and we also explain why we get seeming counterexamples to Modus Tollens. Okay, so just sum up. So an argument is more. I try to persuade you that just a set of sentences, premises, and a conclusion. It is partly individuated by its structure. The structure dictates how context changes in a way that builds the proposition of pattern expressed, in a way that actually builds its logical form, if you like. And this is crucial for individuating argument patterns. This is crucial for characterizing validity because it allows you for keeping track of potential equivocations that are induced as a matter of a context change. So it's not only that we allow that the context changes throughout an argument, but we allow it to do so in a way that still allows us to keep track of the logical form expressed, or the informational pattern expressed, if you like. And representing the effects of discourse structure within the logical form allows us to basically have this kind of a system. And one thing I will say that I will just assert, but it's true, the dynamic system of this form can provably embeds classical logic, right? So, so that's a result in the show. And I'm going to stop.